This podcast is part of the Deluxe Edition Network. To find other great shows on the network, head over to deluxeeditionnetwork.com. That's deluxeeditionnetwork.com.
The year is 1994, and three of the most respected talents in cinematic history came together to bring us a star-studded feat of cinema. Forget about Star Wars and Indiana Jones. In my opinion, George Lucas, Willard Hulk, and Gloria Katz peaked with RADIOLAND Murders, a tribute to slapstick and chaotic comedies of the 1930s and 40s. But as much fun as this film is, were 90s audiences, and critics for that matter, really lining up for tributes to slapstick? Instead, we get this madcap, chaotic musical comedy starring Mary Stuart Masterson, Michael McKean, Jeffrey Tambor, and the tragically underappreciated Brian Benben. On opening night of the new radio station WBN, chaos reigns when writers can't write, actors can't act, and singers can't sing, but that all takes a back seat when mysterious murders begin to take place around the station. We are bringing back this long-forgotten box office misfire, RADIOLAND Murders. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony. And to help me out with that is my co-host and friend, Justin Henson of the Movie Wire. Justin, RADIOLAND Murders. I saw it in the theater. It was something I was really excited for. I'll get to that in a little bit. But just like my little intro, I really think that this musical comedy madcap screwball film was just made in the wrong time. And as I started researching into it, it literally was made in the wrong time. And we'll dive into that into a second. But like I always have to do, get your opinion and your history with this movie, because we haven't talked about it a lot, but I had a feeling that you kind of like it because you were excited for this episode. But I really don't know. Let us get your opinion.
Well, that can go two ways. It could be I'm excited for a debate, or I'm excited that I love the movie.
Right.
But this one I didn't see in the theater. I remember seeing this with my parents on TV, and this is one that when the movie ended, my parents talked about it. They hated it. With me, God, I can't remember. I must have been like 12, 13, 14 maybe. This is one of those that, like we talked about with The Ghost in the Darkness, at that time, I can't find a reason why somebody didn't like this movie. But rewatching it, and I haven't rewatched this movie. I got excited when you put it on the list. I haven't watched this movie since then. And now I can kind of understand why, but that's not a bad thing, because this does have a lot of almost guilty pleasure elements to it that just is wildly entertaining. But it's not without its flaws, which we'll get into. A lot of things that I like, a lot of things I didn't like. But all in all, this is one of those movies where you take it as a comedic murder mystery. It's one of those movies that you literally turn your brain off, get in the ride, let it take you, and then wait for the outcome. And whether it's rewarding, these opinions on this movie is going to be across the board, I'm sure. It's going to be one of those where you loved it or hate it, I think.
Definitely. Yeah, I think so.
But at the end of the day, it's one of those movies that you just flip on and you just watch. It's a theme park ride. It's a comedic theme park ride.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't say it any better myself. This movie is not one to be known for its plot structure, right? Or its character development. It is just a madcap screwball comedy from start to finish. It never slows down. It only gets faster. mad world, right? I think it's kind of the same realm where it's you either like that kind of comedy that just doesn't stop, it just keeps on going, and it's going to throw a bevy of characters and a bevy of character actors at you, and do you have the resilience to keep up with it? I do. We've had this conversation on my other show. We talked about movies like Get Crazy that Alan Arkish directed. That's just a bunch of crazy characters in a situation that doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's just madcap chaos. Not everyone is tuned in to that kind of film, and that's what this is. So let's go into a little bit of history with it, first of all. The one thing that I did know is that this was supposed to be produced back in the 1970s. So George Lucas, Willard Huyck, and Gloria Katz, who they came together and they did American Graffiti. They wrote that together. This was kind of supposed to be an American Graffiti prequel. In fact, the characters were supposed to be the parents of some of the kids in American Graffiti. Then Star Wars happened, and everything that they had planned took a back seat. Then just decades later, after Star Wars and Indiana Jones, Huyck and Katz co-wrote Temple of Doom, which is my personal favorite Indiana Jones movie. So you can see there's some of that kind of chaotic flair, especially with the opening scene in Club Obi-Wan, where it's a tribute to Bubsby Berkeley, essentially, with the anything goes stuff. You can see where their minds are. They put out Howard the Duck in '86. Massive bomb, guilty pleasure of mine. Haven't covered it on the show, probably will someday though. And this was like the next thing that they were all going to do together, as if they didn't learn their lesson with Howard the Duck. Lucas comes together and produces this in 1994. We're not to the Star Wars prequels yet, and we're not quite to the next chapter of Indiana Jones. Like, Lucas is kind of in like a holding pattern in the mid 90s, right? So they put this out. And when you think about it, the technical aspects of this movie, for what kind of movie it is, are mind-blowing. The sets are mind-blowing. The radio station itself is all computer generated on the outside. So you could see that they were testing the waters with virtual sets and digital environments that he would end up using in the prequels like 5-6 years later. And if you are a film geek and you're a Lucas geek, this really is a missing piece of that puzzle that you should go back and, enjoy, even though it's not Star Wars, but you can see where they were starting to tool the technology with it. Literally, this was just a script they had that said, hey, let's make this movie since we're in a holding pattern right now, and we can play with some of this technology. And like you just said, it works for some and it doesn't work for others.
Yeah, and when we take the 90s, we had a lot of these goofball comedies come out, and it almost feels like Lucas wanted a piece of that pie, but he wanted to do it his way with something he's passionate about.
Right.
And you take his American Graffiti, and down the pipeline, he once said that this was almost a prequel to American Graffiti, with our two main characters being the parents of Richard Dreyfuss, a very loose prequel. And you can tell that he wanted to do something. And, the movie cost $15 million to make. This is almost chump change with the success of Star Wars at this point. So now, was it a lesson learned from Lucas? I don't know. But this definitely was a hit in the gut when it comes to how movies are looked at. And we've talked about these timepieces in the early 90s a few times now. And everybody tried to get their hands in the cookie jar on a success, a good period piece. And this one, out of all the ones we've talked about, probably had the best shot. You have a great cast, you have a fantastic lineup of writers, and it was just a great setup. But the question mark that we'll have probably a huge discussion about is, where was the miss? Is it the period piece? Is it the pacing? Is it the actual funniness of it? To me, I have a pretty strong opinion of a little mixed bag of all of them.
Yeah.
But, we also have Bullets Over Broadway that came out with the same kind of style and period that this was released that same week. So it had competition. So Whether it was the right time, that could be in question too. So there's a lot of question marks on this movie of what went wrong. To me, what went wrong is one, I think the movie at the time wasn't ready for the attention span of the audience then. So if we look at the audience now with a shorter attention span of being used to big explosions, CGI effects, quick cuts every 25 seconds, this movie was almost meant for today because we are not used in the 90s to a lot of this slapstick, and the intent is there. The intent, you can't go wrong, of creating something that's purely magical when it comes to the quick cuts. Every character has a line to make it feel more chaotic. But my hat goes off to the editor of this movie that must have had a nervous breakdown when he was cutting this movie. So the intent, if I took anything away from this movie, it's the pure intent of what they were trying to do. And there's a level of respect for me, without destroying this movie, that I can really respect on what the concept was.
Well, and this is where, like, I don't want to sound pretentious, but you have to know what they're doing with this movie. And I think that's one of the things that we saw in the early mid 90s, where I'm not going to say older directors, but not Tarantino's, right? We're having a nostalgia for the cinema of the 30s and 40s. It's all over the place, and none of it did very well at the box office. I mean, the same year as this, you had the Coens' biggest bomb at the time, Hudsucker Proxy, in the same rough era that this takes place, right? And it has a lot of the same kind of slapstick comedy, the same homage to madcap and screwball comedies of like Howard Hawks and Preston Sturges. Like, that's what they were going for. But it was one of those things where it's like they were making a movie for them, not really making a movie for an audience of that particular time. Like, you can't make a movie like this for the Jurassic Park audience. And that was the audience you had in 1994. They didn't want to see this shit, right? And the people that would enjoy it were either older people that had a memory and like an appreciation and nostalgia for these kind of movies, or nerds like me who would go to Blockbuster and rent old Abbott and Costello movies. Which brings me to my next point. My favorite Abbott and Costello movie of all of them is 1941's Who Done It, which takes place in a radio station run by a military colonel, just like this one, that features very similar murders that happen in this one. So obviously, Lucas and Huck and Katz had an appreciation for that particular movie because they've borrowed a lot of elements from it and essentially added music to it. The plot structure is almost the exact same, where in that one, Abbott and Costello are pretending to be radio writers and try and solve the mystery, where in this one, you actually have the radio writer trying to solve the mystery. So my appreciation for this may be connected to the fact that it's kind of an homage to one of my favorite Abbott and Costello movies, and just the style of it is all. But we got to talk about the main thing about this movie that kind of blows my mind, and that is the enormous cast, starting with Mary Stuart Masterson, Ned Beatty, George Burns, Brian James, Michael Lerner, Michael McKean, Jeffrey Tambor, Stephen Tobolowsky, Christopher Lloyd, Larry Miller, Corbin Burnson, Rosemary Clooney, and George Burns in his final film performance. It definitely was attractive to these stars, right? I mean, okay, this is a Lucas movie, right? This is going to be huge, and there's a part for all of us, and we get to play and have fun with it. I can see how it's very attractive for an actor, but we've seen films like this before where maybe there's too many actors. Maybe there's too many people to pay attention to that don't have a lot of time, and once their time is up and they're gone, well, you kind of miss them, right? But the movie moves so fast that you have to like catch up with who's coming in next and who's coming in next. Like the writer's room is crazy. You've got Peter McNichol. You've got Harvey Korman. You know, you've got just so many names, and they're all so great. That's where it kind of comes off as like, I'm going to say a prestige piece or an ego piece for Lucas of like, look how many people I can get in my movie. And sometimes that doesn't compensate for where storytelling and plot structure and just an overall solid narrative comes into play, right?
Well, I think you really nailed it with just that point, because to your original point, the people that this was targeted for, maybe the older generation. We see that a little bit in the cast. We see that a little bit in the nostalgic piece of it. And when we get to the older generation, with how fast this movie goes,
Yeah.
the target's a little bit off.
Right. It doesn't
But
match that.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think my biggest problem with this movie is how many characters is in this, because we'll get almost a structured script here where we have to ensure that every character, every big name gets their one-liner, gets their 3 sentences of dialogue, move on to the next character, move on to the next character. And that's where we get the transition scenes where it almost becomes so repetitive that we're just waiting to see this long list of characters deliver their lines so we can move on to what happens next. And it is a lot to take in. And I think this is where I strongly think this is where you have to turn off your brain, not go into this as a murder mystery of a who done it, because there's no way you can piece together all the clues because it goes so quick. And I think we'll get into it later in the when our critics go into it, but I think he defined it perfectly. Is within the first 20 minutes, I felt like I needed to breathe into a paper bag because of how quick it was going. This isn't set up for a movie with, especially with people with anxiety, that just it feels like you're in an argument and you can't get a word in. So the movie goes incredibly quick. And you have to really pay attention to the jokes, because if you get up to go to the bathroom in this movie, I wouldn't say you would miss something, but you're definitely going into like a fight that's already started and you don't know who started it.
Right. Like every scene, there's a chaotic conflict between one or more characters, right? And the whole thing focuses around our 2 main players, and that is Mary Stuart Masterson, fresh off of Fried Green Tomatoes, right? And here what I like about her performance in this is that she doesn't go the classic transatlantic woman like Jennifer Jason Leigh would in Hudsucker Proxy. She's more of like kind of a tough as nails, but still feminine. And that is one of the things that makes that character so appealing. Now, her husband is the main writer for this, and it's played by Brian Benben. And that is a guy who I've just always had a huge appreciation for. This would have been like his feature film, right? Where he is the star. And because it crashed, he never really got a chance to make up for that. He did some indie stuff or played some side characters in some movies, but this was like the only one where he really had a main role. And it's a hard role. It is that pitter patter, fast dialogue, high energy, Cary Grant type kind of character, not as charming or suave. He's actually more, kind of disheveled and a mess. He's a writer. He gets paid $40 a week, but the performance is there, man. Like the performance for what it needs to be, to have the energy to go through this, almost 2-hour movie of just nonstop scene changes and costume changes. I mean, the third act, he has to go from costume to costume to costume, which I love that. I love having a guy have to go in like several different costumes throughout a movie, especially in a chaotic setting like that, where you have to wear a mascot outfit and then you're dressed up as Carmen Miranda with a banana on the head. Like all that stuff is fun for me. It just takes me back to all the fun slapstick comedies of the days that I really, really enjoyed. But I have a hard time imagining anyone else in that role, honestly, of that time and space. Like I was thinking about it when I was watching it like a third time with my partner. Like, okay, so Tom Hanks, I don't see Tom Hanks doing this. I don't see a Richard Dreyfuss doing this. Like I don't see anyone at that time. Maybe a Robin Williams, but then it would be too much energy. Like the dude really brought the energy that this role needed.
Yeah, I mean, originally Steve Martin was approached for this role, and I think that would have been a
back in the
complete
70s, though.
Yeah, and I think that would have been a complete miss, because I do agree with you. Brian Benben did a fantastic job, but what I think the miss with his character is we got too much of him in the second half of the movie. where we go and take away the focus from the murderer, where we go maybe 45 minutes maybe without hearing a lot about the murders. I think the murders are really sporadically unplaced, and I don't think, even though I love Brian Benben's performance, I don't think it did him justice with focusing so much on him. And I agree with you. I say it over and over again, I love chaotic comedies, and that character change, or when they play In the Mood and we have Ned Beatty marching with his cops down the hallways. I love all those elements. And I think it almost would be better if we slowed down the first half and focus more on the high speed transitions in the second half to really give that chaotic situation that Brian Benben was going through with the character changes, and then running into everything and just trying to run from the police. So I think the character was misrepresented or not written correctly, or well balanced. I think there's a complete potential here with Brian Benben if it slowed down to really show what he can do. There is a scene where he has the fire hose, and I love this scene, but they kept, again, the main problem in the movie, they kept transitioning away from it, and we would get, okay, so he's firing it, now he took down the speaker, cut away, cut back, now he's up off his feet on the fire hose. Focus on the character, focus on one comedic element. We don't have to go in and out with it. Show what Brian Benben can do with this role without 15-second clips. And I think that was my biggest frustration, because he is one of the best pieces of the movie. And we have Mary Stuart Masterson as the anchor, the serious piece of it, that is the only one kind of going slower in the movie. She
Agreed.
is the one to really kind of balance that out. And I think if we had more screen time between Roger and Penny, that could have really taken this comedy to a next level.
So with the director, Mel Smith, he's the albino from Princess Bride, but he was also on the BBC. He was a comedian, and he did this movie back in the 80s that he directed called Morons from Space. And it's kind of a cult classic, and it's one of those love it or hate it. I'm kind of on the fence because I've watched it twice because it's a cult film. I still have a hard time grasping it, right? Because it is just it's kind of nonsense. Interesting choice to direct this movie, and I don't know his work well enough to say that any of this is like really his fault when it comes down to how the story goes, because the editing is so chaotic. How it feels to me is that he shot a lot of fun scenes, but he shot a lot of them. And so the editor had to find a way to make this feel like it wasn't an up and down of energy, highs and lows. They kept with the chaotic pace, because when you think about it, the scenes move slow. The shots and the cuts move fast. And I think that's why some of the energy feels off in certain moments. Like you said, when there's music playing and you can have all these high energy moments with the music, that's when it really works. It's all the things in between that are supposed to be the plot development points, right? It's supposed to be the exposition that helps us understand what the murders are and why they're happening and who's the suspect. But then it gets all flushed away in the chaos and the music and the comedy. So I agree with you 100% where the unevenness is very distracting to some. But also, I'm a creature of chaos and I kind of feed off that. That's why I can't be a justifiable critic, because I don't think that my tastes are even keel enough to give you a good review of something. It's going to be inherently biased based off of my scatterbrained likes and dislikes about movies.
I think the performances have the potential of being good, but they don't get the opportunity. The energy is there. The entire cast shows the energy. So there is no question that if the film was made properly, we would see some spotlights of these performances. It has a great cast. The problem we have with this is, again, I think we'll have a hard time disagreeing with anybody that's watched this movie, is the pacing. This is like Noises Off when you watch it at fast forward. It's it's you can't appreciate the comedy when you think you heard a joke, but you didn't hear a joke. You think you're trying to make out what the murderer is saying, but we don't have time to process it or even gain the clues. As a comedy, it kind of misses. As a murder mystery, it kind of misses. And again, the editing by Peter Trejo is kind of a sign that I think Mel Smith had more control than our editor did. Either that or he went all in on the energy of the feel of it, because this is a director that did Bean. That is a complete opposite of pacing of comedy when it comes to this movie. So it's curious to me that I think the communication breakdown between the technical aspects of this film being in post production fell apart, because it has, like I said, all the elements to be great, but we can't take it in. It's almost like I have to watch this on slow motion to really listen to the dialogue, to really kind of gain a feeling of what they were trying to do. So the writing, it's a bunch of one-liners that just go from character to character, like I said, which doesn't really help build the story. And then the second half, we just have almost a comedic fugitive, almost a separate movie going on, and we don't hear from the murderer. So it needs to kind of figure out what it wants to be, or allow the audience to really grasp the jokes or grasp the clues of trying to make us decide how to interpret this movie. And that's where I think the biggest miss is not really knowing exactly where it wanted to go in post production.
Who was your favorite character in the movie?
It has to go from two. Again, I liked Brian Benben's performance, but I'm a Ned Beatty nut.
Yeah, he's great.
His on-screen likability just can't be beat, and the way he plays the general. What I appreciate about Ned Beatty is he's not the best actor in the world, but he's like that fun uncle that if you ask him to do an impersonation, he'll go all in and just have fun with it. So I did enjoy Ned Beatty, and I did. I would have to say Scott Michael Campbell, actually. I think he did a fantastic job. It just kind of reminded me of Blame It on the Bellboy to an extent.
Yeah.
So he had this really silliness to him, and then he gets his moment towards the end that really made me happy. But again, we run into the problem that it just transitions really quick for us not to appreciate the happiness this guy brings to the table.
And he also reminded me too of Buzz, the elevator operator in Hudsucker Proxy. Like you could really tell that they were going for a certain type of character in this movie, very much like the other period pieces that we just talked about. Whatever that inspiration was to start putting things in the 30s and 40s, Barton Fink as well. You know, it's a tribute to those things. I cannot get over how amazing and hilarious Michael McKean is as the band leader in this movie. Hardly has any lines. It's all performance. He's supposed to be like a Spike Jonze type character, right? He's got the little baton and he's doing all of his dances. And every time there's a musical number, he's dressed for it. Whether it's like the maraca number, if it's like a Latin flair number, in the mood. And it's a performance that every time I start getting distracted by something else and it pops back on the screen with the band, because the band essentially brings in the scene changes. Every time there's a scene change or like a new plot development, there's a song. And then he comes out in a different costume. And it's just fantastic. Like that's by far my favorite character of the movie. And I think it's almost like the movie itself to me is enjoyable because of that, because of all those musical scene changes.
When you asked that question, he's the first one that popped into my head, but for the reason of how many speaking lines he has, I went against it.
Yeah.
But the energy he brings when he's conducting the band, it just brings me back to all those videos, all those movies I see of these conductors performing alongside their band to really encourage the audience to interact. And it's a lot of fun. And I wish we would have gotten a little bit more of him. And where he does that last, I think it's the last scene change where he dresses and he gives a line of, I think it's kill the person that decided this, where he has to dress in the sombrero and all that. Those are the slower scenes that really, and the slower scenes where we actually get to take in kind of those lines. And that's what I really appreciated about that is I thought to myself, this is the first time I think I actually caught a joke and I can actually let it sink in.
Right.
And I thought it was funny. And I think it's because I was zeroing in on him because he does subtly kind of steal the show in the background. And when he actually delivers a line, it's just comedic gold. I absolutely loved his silent almost performance.
So the whole reason why I put this movie on the list is because you put Oscar on the list. And I'm like, okay, now it's time for my madcap comedy, which is Radioland Murders. And when you think about it, the two have a lot in common in the sense of like they were made for audiences that probably just weren't into that particular kind of film in the 1990s. It was the decade of Stallone and Schwarzenegger and Bruce Willis and art house and Pulp Fiction. It was always going forward, and these kind of backdated period pieces just didn't do too hot. But it's an interesting thing that we keep going back to them. We keep going back to Screwball. I brought Seem Like Old Times. You brought Oscar. Now we're to Radioland Murders. There'll probably be more in the future. But at the end of the day, before we get to our critics, I'm just going to say, like I say so many times, like I know this is not a great movie, but it's a fun movie. So it's really like pick your poison. Are you going to go have fun, or are you going to go be pretentious about, the piece of cinema that you're given? This is just fun. Like, I don't even want to even call it a movie sometimes because it has a hard time being a movie throughout its runtime. Let's hear what our critics had to say about this one.
Slapstick comedy is very loud and very broad, and yet it requires a delicate touch, and few films demonstrate that better than Radioland Murders, precisely because it doesn't have a delicate touch, or much of any touch at all for that matter. The movie takes place in Chicago in 1939, when a new radio network is about to go on the air.
So, yeah, he kind of brings out the criticism at first. At first, when I watch this review, I'm like, oh, he's complimenting it. He's going to say that, oh, yeah, we needed a good slapstick comedy back in the theaters for this new generation. And then he's like, but this is exactly the opposite of what we wanted. And it's kind of the critical response to what you and I have both been saying, where this really wasn't the right time. And as much as I want to give it the props for being a tribute and an homage to those films I like, it's almost like when you see like an MTV version of something that's classic, right? Or another example, when Baz Luhrmann did Romeo and Juliet with a music video sensibility. A lot of people hated it because it was, shitting on tradition. That's what I feel he looks at this as, is like, this is someone making a hyper stylized, gimmicky attempt at slapstick that he enjoys, and that's why he doesn't feel so thrilled about it. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is one because understand, Roger is like, he needs his characters in his comedies. He is all about the character development in comedies. I think he said it in the review right after in Bullets versus Broadway, is that you need to have characters turn into people before they can become funny.
Right.
And that's one thing that I think the first 5 minutes we get hit with visuals, then the stunning set design, it sets that expectation. And when we get into kind of the fast pace of what we get, that's where Roger loses the characters that he so desperately looks for in a comedy. So, and I think right from the first 15, 20 to 30 minutes, this is where it really lost Roger when it comes to the comedy he enjoys. And to an extent, he's not wrong. But at the same time, he is specifically looking for something to humor him because, again, comedy is so subjective.
That's one of the things that, like, I always think about whenever we have a conversation about what else they had on these particular episodes, right? I mean, they did Clerks on the same one as Radioland Murders, Bullets Over Broadway, and I like it like that. 4 very, very different movies. Bullets Over Broadway, closer to this one, but that's more of a dialogue. It's a Woody Allen thing, where this is just pure chaos. And we've mentioned that before, where it's like when we look at the other films on the list, and especially films that he likes, and we hear the reason why he likes them, it only makes sense that the film that he dislikes the most is like the polar opposite of whatever he's watching that week. Just for example, too, like when we talked about Melvin and Howard, where he said, hey, normally if you watch the first 10 minutes of a movie of just 2 guys sitting in a truck talking and singing a made-up song, you'd be like, well, what is this movie? Get me out of here. But he appreciated it because it built a relationship not only with those characters, but with the audience as well. This movie doesn't do that. This movie forgets it has an audience, right?
Yeah, 100%. Because, and we look at the generational thing too, where we talk about attention spans. I mean, if we look at Siskel and Ebert at this time, was this movie the period piece targeted towards them? And this is where I'm probably, I think, around their age at the time they are now. And to me, looking back, I can kind of see it because I didn't have as much fun as I did as a kid watching this movie because it is set up more like a cartoon.
Yeah.
So it's zany. So, and that's not the type of humor that I think as we grow and mature that we kind of look for. We can appreciate it, we can enjoy it at times, but it's not the type that we're looking for if we're kind of visiting the theater and spending our money for. And I think that's kind of what they were looking at when it comes to a critical review.
Finally gets monotonous watching all these people running around and screaming. Comedy, even slapstick comedy, depends on characters more than simple physical activity, and Radioland Murders never slows down enough to realize that.
Oh, I agree with you, Roger. That's exactly the problem with the picture. It's all decor and all movement and very similar movement. People are always bumping into each other in halls. Nobody can get anywhere through a sentence, through a hallway, without having it be funny. And at a quick point, I'd say 20 minutes into this picture, I was worn out.
I was too. It's a kind of a disappointment too because they had the cast in place, they had the set in place. They didn't have a script that was worth filming.
They didn't write a single compelling character.
I can't disagree with either of them because from a critical standpoint, they're 100% right. That kind of goes back to my whole thing of like, and we actually had a debate about this on Twitter about someone saying, oh, how many times does a person have to watch a film before they finally grasp it? Good question. I don't have the answer for that, but I can tell you that this movie, the more and more I watch it, the more and more I like it because A, I'm high energy, the characters are high energy, but it's one of those films where the characters don't have enough time for you to understand their motivations, so you start creating motivations for them. It's almost like a choose your own adventure book, right? Where you really can start creating pathways for these characters and their development when the movie doesn't do it for you. And the reason why I think I do that with this movie is because it's not the characters that are great, it's the actors and the performers in these roles that are great. I mean, Christopher Lloyd doesn't really have any dialogue other than the sound effects that he's making for the show, but that is a very memorable character that he is portraying. And it's one of the things that keeps making me go back to the movie. Same thing with Michael Lerner as the detective. You know, he plays that role perfectly. It's one note as a character, but he gives it depth. Even Brian James, who's just a cornball actor and everything, he is like the main sponsor who's watching this to see if he's going to get his money to the station. And he's like a real hard ass. But then there's a scene where the laughing gas gets put into his room. And I die laughing every single time because it's not the character that's funny, it's what he's doing. So that is where I think I enjoy this movie so much, even though I know it's highly flawed. They're 100% right. When they say they have the cast in place, they're correct. The cast was in place. It's the characters themselves that weren't interesting. It's the performances that are interesting. But you can't build a whole movie just off of that, right?
Absolutely, because I didn't watch this review until after I rewatched it. I wanted to kind of have a fresh eyes on it. And I think Gene, to his credit, stated my exact feelings within the first 30 minutes is exhausting after the first 20 minutes. And that's kind of how I felt with the first 30 minutes of it, or the 20 minutes of it. But I think this one where you get to the rewatch value is because this is a movie that almost requires a rewatch because it's so fast, so quick that it's almost impossible not to take something away the next time you see it. I almost have to prep myself saying, I think that was funny. I need to pay attention to that next time I view it or rewind it. So this one, I think they are absolutely right with it. And if I were to review it today, if it came out today, I'd probably give it a horrible review too. But it's one of those, I think, that I would at the time disapprove of it, but later down the road, if I'm laying in bed, turn it on if I just want to turn my brain off and see some fantastic cast and watch them just have some energy and have some fun with it. And I think the intent, if I were to describe this movie, is if you just want to watch some great people, some great actors, just have some fun, watch this movie, but have no expectations whatsoever. But in a critical level, you cannot argue with their points, because I don't think, when it comes to how fast it goes, there shouldn't be an argument to it, because that does bog down the movie, where it's almost a 2-hour runtime. If it actually slowed down, this would be almost a 3.5 to 4 hour runtime to tell this story. So, or it'd have to go through complete rewrites. So this script is a huge script. And I think they didn't take advantage of what they really had with it. And I think that's what they're really looking at too, when it comes to Gene referring to, there's nothing of substance in this writing, because really there isn't, or we don't grasp it on the first viewing.
I mean, you stole my whole speech, essentially, where this is a 3-hour movie condensed into a 2-hour movie because nobody in charge wanted to cut anything. And it's obvious. Like, there's so much that could have gone, that should have gone. Like, if this would have been a 90-minute runtime, let's say cut a bunch of the little chaotic moments out and just turn it into whodunit murder mystery in a radio station, you've got something there. You've got, like they said, you've got the aesthetic. The sets are great. The costumes are great. The music is great. It is kind of a shame that they didn't prioritize the story and they didn't prioritize the important characters enough to make that more concise of a film, therefore more enjoyable. The movie is so chaotic because they're shoving 3 hours of movie into a 2-hour time frame, 100%.
Well, and if somebody were to say to see this movie, I mean, again, the set design, like you said, it's beautiful. It's engaging to watch all the sets, all the costumes. The music is spot on. You can't really go wrong with the score by Joel McNeely, because he has a lot of experience with a lot of cartoons that we have, like Tiny Toons, Darkwing, a lot of Disney films, a lot of TV kind of quirky stuff. And I think this is a movie of pure perfection of casting, but the execution was wrong. And it's almost disappointing and frustrating to a point to see the execution level of what this could have been. I would honestly rather see a 3-hour movie of them taking their time to really appreciate the talent involved in this movie.
Yeah, it is a shame. Now, one of the things I think is interesting too is how difficult this movie actually is to watch. I mean, so you can rent it on Amazon, and it's like a $5 rental. It's one of the more pricey ones, but it's never had a proper Blu-ray. I think the one that I've seen online is probably a bootleg. My DVD, which is whatever, 20 years old, is actually a really, really great transfer for a DVD. I was really surprised how good it stood up. So I'm glad we still have that. But I think one of the main reasons why this movie doesn't get talked about more was just strict availability. Wasn't in theaters for very long because it was a bomb. It was on the video shelves, but you don't know what it is. If you look at the cover, I mean, you only get Mary Stuart Masterson, Brian Benben, and a couple people on the cover. You don't get the rest of the cast. So if you don't know who those people are, I mean, Brian Benben at the time, he mostly was just known from Dream On, his show on HBO, and that was kind of it. So it wasn't really a draw aesthetically as a video case to get grabbed off the video shelf either. And there's very little chatter about it in film Twitter. There's very little chatter about it on Instagram or in the cult film circles that I swim in. So I don't want to say it's a lost movie, because it's not lost, but it definitely somehow has just kind of fallen off the radar. And I don't know. I'm not going to say it's because a critical thing. It's just because I think not enough people knew what it was, or not enough people cared what it was at the time, where it just kind of drifted away, you know?
I think with this one, this is the type of movie that was, in my opinion, designed to be to streaming, because viewers can take their time with it. If they need to rewind it or rewatch it, they can. Given that, of course, there's going to be some box office success that's going to really affect it. The age is going to really affect it. From 94 doing over just $1 million in the box office. But again, we've seen success stories from a lot of these films that come out with an attractive cast. But the problem's going to be, are these cast members known by newer viewers getting into streaming, is going to be the bet. So The question and the difficulty would be, are we past that mark of generations knowing and appreciating this cast that's involved into this movie? So that would be the only challenge to release this to streaming now. If you found it, it would be somebody clicking on it by accident to go and view it.
Right, which is a way that a lot of old movies grow these days. Like if they're on Tubi or if they're on Freevee or Pluto TV, like, oh, I found this for free. I watched it and it was actually kind of crazy and fun. I want to watch it again. But no one's going to spend $5 on a movie they don't know about and no one's really talking about. So I think that is the next hindrance in it too. And even if it got a beautiful Blu-ray or 4K release, I don't think there's enough people that even know what this movie is to get excited about it. For example, Killer Clowns from Outer Space just got released on 4K as a pre-order, and it sold out day one, right? That's a movie that, okay, it's not a great movie, but it's fun, it's campy, it's a cult classic. People are willing to spend $200 on it, boom, and it's done. This one, I don't think so, because not enough people know about it. And how do they not? It's George Lucas, you know?
Yeah. Well, and again, it's horror, cult horror. That is huge. People actively seek that out versus cult comedy, right? Because
Right.
comedy frequently changes over the years. The way you kill somebody in a movie becomes more of a comedy from older movies than it does current. So I think comedies, again, where we stand in comedies now, it's not actively sought out after now because there's such a timid opinion around how comedies are, and you're really rolling the dice on getting a good comedy, especially with how vast the opinions are on comedy from South Park all the way to Abbott and Costello, right? So, I mean, yeah, risking paying money for this movie on a Blu-ray, I don't think is good. It's another big gamble for this movie to come out. But I think when it comes to horror cult classics, that's a different story because there's active, huge collectors around that piece on it. But
Yeah, and that
I'll tell you,
audience is getting bigger.
yeah, but I'll tell you, when it comes to comedies, to really appreciate comedies coming out, even though they're extremely tame, now is the time to revisit comedy from early 2000s and under, because there is nothing funny coming out nowadays that really rolls the dice, that really takes you to the edge. So if you want to see a good comedy, I mean, the 90s and 80s is the best time to do it, and there really should be a bigger following around it.
I mean, this is just me thinking outside of the box, but Only Murders in the Building is such a huge success right now. It's getting another season. People are loving that. It's not too far removed from the concepts and energy that a movie like this, or let's say Murder by Death, from Neil Simon back in the day. It's not too far removed from this particular kind of genre. So I would say that now is the perfect time to see if, the iron's hot enough to let something like this out into the wild and let people discover it. So now that we have talked about this movie in detail and listened to what they had to say, let's rate our critics' reviews. Rather concise on this one from Siskel's aspect because Roger kind of took over. And this is later in their time where they started doing a lot of their review and critique over the trailer, over the clips that they were playing, not so much the discourse between the two of them. So I think that's another reason why Gene doesn't have so much to say. But I can't disagree with what he said. His few lines and few sentences make a lot of sense, and they reflect all the things that you said. Just because I'm a fanboy for this movie doesn't mean that he's wrong. So I give him a solid B on this one. And the reason why is because the dude just doesn't know how to have fun sometimes, Yes, you're exhausted, but you can't tell me that there's some fun in this movie that didn't get you. You can't tell me that you didn't chuckle at some moments because there's so many rapid fire laughs. At least a few of them hit you. Don't lie, Gene. That's why you get a B.
There's a certain level of respect I have for both of their reviews because this is one that if it was me, I would have probably bought a ticket a second time to see it. And I know they're not in a place to do that. So there is a lot to this movie that may have required me to go to a second time. But all the bullet points are there. All the things that I kind of see and that were frustrating me really were pinpointed with both of them. But I think they were just really articulated by Ebert a little bit better. when it comes to the why, when it comes to what made it feel more chaotic, what didn't work with the speed of the film, and what made it kind of exhausting in Gene's terms. So I think with him, I think he did a fantastic job with it. So I think it's a solid 3 stars.
Cool.
What I really wanted from this review is to really talk more about the comedy instead of just saying it's bad, with humor being subjective, especially with the vast variety in the 90s. I think I would have liked to hear just why it wasn't funny to him, except for just the technicalities of things that didn't work. But I think it's a solid 3 star.
So since this was on the same episode of At the Movies with Bullets Over Broadway, I got to ask you, which do you prefer, this or Bullets Over Broadway?
Bullets Over Broadway, 100%. Because and truth be told, I'm not a huge Woody Allen fan, but Bullets Over Broadway, I thought, did a better job with its dry humor. I'm not a dry humor kind of guy, but I think the characters were more engaging than the humor was. So as a comedy, I think I was a little bit more invested just because of the characters. And if I were to agree with what Roger's statement of you need to build characters into people before it becomes funny, that I wholeheartedly agree with, because I'm not going to laugh at just a prop on the screen.
Yeah, I mean, I will take Radioland Murders over Bullets Over Broadway. Not to say I'm not a huge fan of Bullets Over Broadway, but I've always thought that Bullets Over Broadway was a little bit just overrated and relied heavily on Diane Wiest's recognition for the movie, because I didn't see it until after the Oscars, until after, seeing the clips they played of her and Cusack on the bench, don't speak, don't speak. And then I watched the movie, and the movie didn't live up to the hype that the Oscars built up for it. That's not to say it's a bad movie, but I always tell you, my litmus test is if I grab it off the shelf, and I don't even have Bullets Over Broadway on the shelf, but I've got Radioland Murders. So that's where I kind of sit on this one.
Well, and that goes to the interpretation of humor, right? Because
right, 100%. No one's right, no one's wrong.
Yeah, it's just mere opinion, and you can't really argue with that.
So now that we have talked about a slapstick screwball madcap comedy, Justin's pick for next week is probably the most cliche fanboy pick that we'll have on the show for a while. But damn it if I'm not excited for it. We are going to be talking about 1992's Reservoir Dogs, the debut of Quentin Tarantino, and the controversial take that Siskel and Ebert had on it. So look forward to that one.
Hey, this one I picked mainly for the review because I have a feeling the review is going to be a bigger discussion than the movie.
Oh, I'm fired up already, and I haven't even started. We haven't even started that episode yet. So next week should definitely be interesting. So anyway, everyone, thank you for listening to this. Go find Radioland Murders if you haven't seen it. It is worth a watch. I wouldn't have it on the show if it wasn't. It's definitely worth. It might be your thing. It might not be your thing, but go check it out. As always, you can find me, Antonio, on the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast. You can look up the Cult-Worthy Studios on Instagram and Facebook and on Letterboxd, so you can see our reviews of that. Justin is over at the Movie Wire, and where can people find you?
You can find me on themoviewire.com. You can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and all the socials at Movie Wire Show.
So yeah, we are just steaming ahead on this podcast. I know we ask every week, but we are serious now. Send us movies you want us to discuss. As long as they've been reviewed by Siskel and Ebert, we are looking for your suggestions, for your ideas, and for your feedback. We got some Twitter feedback finally of, people saying how we were talking about these movies. May not have been the most positive review, but it's engaging, and that's what we want, is engagement. So let us know what you think. And Justin, I'll see you next week.
See you next week.